So basically, I'm the president, the owner of a consulting company called Pacific Bridge Medical. And I started the company 30 years ago, actually this month. And you can imagine not too many people were interested in the Asian markets 30 years ago, but of course, more and more people are interested in Asia since then. This gives you a sense of some of our clients. And then we get over to Asia. So first of all, how many people have been to Asia in the audience? All right, good. So, the first time I went over was 1988. And in 1988, it was still difficult to get into China, so I took a train from Hong Kong to Guangzhou, China. Has anybody been on that train from Hong Kong to Guangzhou? Well, at the time I was on the train, it was extremely dirty and it was very slow. But being on that train, all of a sudden I heard squawk, squawk, squawk. And I wondered to myself, what could that be? We must have hit some birds or something. No, actually what happened on that train in 1988 was that somebody had killed a chicken in the back of the train. They cooked the chicken, and then they brought the chicken up on a cart on the aisle of the train with people with chopsticks on each side taking chicken. So you know about hepatitis, so that was really quite an experience. Now, if you go back to China now and you take that same train from Hong Kong to Guangzhou, southern China, you have a double-decker train with some of the best food you could ever eat on a train. And so you can see over the 30-year period how much Asia's grown and how much the healthcare markets have done there and how many more devices are made in Asia these days, et cetera. So for people that aren't that familiar with the Asian market, still Japan is the largest medical device market in Asia, followed closely now by China. And on this slide here, we have some of the reasons to source in Asia. Some labor costs and manufacturing costs are cheaper, let's say especially if you go to places like Vietnam and India. The quality of the manufacturing of medical devices has gotten a lot better in Asia. In China in particular, the ability to make high volumes of catheters or drainage bags or blood pressure monitors is quite high. And keep in mind, too, that when you look around the world, the US and the European markets are fairly stagnant as far as the medical device markets go, but the markets in Asia are growing very quickly because of the increasing middle classes throughout the Asian region. Japan has been a very mature market and still growing slowly, but when you look at countries like China, Korea, Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, the middle classes are growing in those markets, and so is the demand for medical products. So a number of companies want to manufacture their products in Asia now so that they can get closer to the customers. So here on this pie chart, you can see that the proportion from 2005 to 2017, the number of people that are now making products, making devices, has greatly increased in the other section there. And 90% of other is actually on the dark color there is from Asia. So anybody currently manufacturing products in China? Just one person? So even for OEMs here at the show, if you're making commodity products, it may be worthwhile to make those commodities in China or Asia and then import them here and make the more sophisticated components here for your medical devices. And then again, on the second line, on the next line here, as I mentioned initially, it may be a lot cheaper to make your devices now in places like Vietnam and India, which still have very, very low labor costs, lower than China. But of course, if you're making your products in Asia, you need to have a lot of due diligence. You have to check the quality. You have to build relationships of trust with the suppliers over there. Now, on the next slide, we're going to talk a little about a project we had, which dealt with a company that was looking to source some devices out of the Asian marketplace. And they were trying to make some disposable packs, and these packs were used to transport venous blood from the body during surgery. And you can see here some of the details on the parts we were looking to source. So the company wanted to reduce the cost. They had been making these products actually in Delaware, United States. And so they asked us to identify some potential suppliers in India. India has been behind China in a large way as far as medical device manufacturing goes. But there are now more and more people making commodity medical device components in India. And here's sort of an outline on the next slide of one of the companies that we talked to. And of course, we talked to about 20 companies in India, and then we narrowed down to the short list of suppliers down to 3 or 4 companies. But what I wanted to show you was some of the salient observations we had as we met these Indian medical device contracting manufacturing companies. And you can see here on the first one, all of the manufacturers who we visited had the basic requirements, such as ISO 13485, et cetera. And most of the companies were making kits and have the capability and infrastructure to make PVC extruders and injection molding units. But all the Indian suppliers told us mold making is an expensive affair, and they all wanted to know what kind of contribution we could make to making the mold for this device we wanted to make in India. And on the next slide here, you can see on number 4, many of the manufacturers are expecting some sort of financial support as a startup for the project. And a number of the suppliers that we met with in India, they couldn't produce all the parts for what we were looking to make, so they were using subcontractors to supply some of the parts. Some other salient observation, there's no single manufacturer that is producing all of the components, and most of them conveyed that they would source the missing components and could fulfill the requirements. Many of them felt giving a quote by merely seeing the components of the product we wanted to make was going to be difficult for them, and they wanted us to provide some more physical samples, and they wanted us to have our R&D team integrate with the Indian medical device suppliers' R&D team to help make the products. So finally, we found there were many issues in India. We were looking for a supplier to make the product in India. There were many issues, including some of the ones that I mentioned and others that are up on the screen. And then finally, we decided to leave India and we went over to Vietnam. Has anybody been over to Vietnam for medical device sourcing or production? So Vietnam, similar to India, is also another low-cost production location. And we found we couldn't find any Vietnamese medical device suppliers that could come up with the components we were trying to make. But we did find 2 companies, one from Malaysia and one from Taiwan. And those Malay and Taiwanese companies had set up subsidiaries in Vietnam to take advantage of the low labor, and we ended up picking one of those companies. So it was basically Malaysian or Taiwanese company making the products in Vietnam. So if you're looking at the China market today and you're thinking, okay, number 1, we could source components from China, commodity components, instead of making those commodity components, let's say, in the United States or Europe. Number 2, we can say we want to get into manufacturing over there, let's try to buy a company. Has anybody tried to buy a company in China over the last year or 2? Okay, how was your experience, sir? What? Terrible. And it was probably terrible because all the prices are jacked up, right? So it's amazing now, like if you're trying to buy a company, whether that's an OEM manufacturer of medical products or a finished medical products manufacturer in China, the prices are sky high, and it's very difficult to make an acquisition these days. That wasn't so much the case 10 years ago when you could make an acquisition of a Chinese company, but that Chinese company, the quality of the products might have been a lot less, not quite as good as they are today. So the other option, if you can't buy a company over there, is to start a greenfield operation. So greenfield, we're basically starting a new manufacturing facility from scratch. And what I did here on the next few slides is I put in some of the, okay, you want to set up a new factory in China, you want to make some medical device components, OEM or finished products, but you need to do certain things to be able to be successful in doing that in China. So the main things you'd have to obtain would be a business license, a medical device manufacturing license, and product registration, obviously, for the products you were going to make if they were finished products. If you were just making components, you would only need the first 2 items. So here we go into a medical device manufacturing license. How can you get that license in China? What are the steps to get the license? And on the next slide here, we have an outline, basically the process and the time frame for domestic Class 3 medical device manufacturer to get the license for the manufacturing facility. On the next slide, obviously, to make medical devices in China today, you have to have a GMP inspection, good manufacturing products inspection. So that's another step along the way of building your own medical device manufacturing facility in China. Finally, on the last step here, it's basically a time chart that says, if you want to set up your own factory in China, these are the major steps. And the process could be anywhere between 1.5 and 3 years, depending on the product, the location, your relationships with the local government officials, et cetera. So obviously, if you're making a device in China or you're sourcing a medical device in China, the main issue is the quality of the product, right? So 15 years ago, when we were sourcing in China for medical device components, the components were really not that great. And if you went to the factories, one factory looked worse than the next factory. But if you go to China today and you go to some OEM medical device manufacturing facilities, or you go to a final medical device manufacturing facility in China, what you find is that the quality has significantly increased. The quality has gotten a lot better. And that's why, for US and European manufacturers, our main competitors now going forward, besides other US or European companies, are Chinese manufacturers. Because Chinese manufacturers now can make very sophisticated medical devices. Anybody in the audience heard of companies like Lepu or Microport? Anybody heard of those? So those are actually Chinese device companies that are making drug-eluting stents. So for example, in the drug-eluting stent market, 6 years ago, foreign companies like Abbott, Medtronic, J&J owned 75% of the Chinese drug-eluting stent market. 6 years later, though, today, what percent of the market, the drug-eluting stent market in China is from foreign manufacturers? Only 25%. So in the course of 6 years, the Chinese drug-eluting manufacturers, drug-eluting stent manufacturers were able to figure out what to do, come up with pretty good quality products, and now they're direct competitors to Abbott, Medtronic, et cetera, not only in China, but they're direct competitors in other international markets, whether that's Brazil or South Africa, et cetera. So I think a lot of times US OEM manufacturers and medical device companies making finished products have no idea about the strength of these growing Chinese device companies. It's not only from China that they're coming out with their more sophisticated devices, it's also happening in places like Japan and Korea. They're coming out with more and more sophisticated medical device products domestically to compete with our foreign products going into those markets. Okay, so on the third client here that we're talking about, we were asked by a US device manufacturer to audit a Chinese factory supplier. Is anybody sourcing components or supplies from a Chinese factory here? Okay, so you know in the corner there that basically the main issue is the quality control and the quality of the products coming out. And as I mentioned today, the quality of the products is significantly better than it was 10 years ago. Now this example is from about 6 years ago. So basically they wanted to get the Chinese factory to meet US FDA standards. We had some initial inspections of the factory, and what we found was that the quality of the factory wasn't so good. Now, of course, this was 6 years ago. And the auditors that are doing the audit for the facility, they must be bilingual, right? I can't tell you how many companies send over only English-speaking quality assurance people to factories in China or a factory in Japan. And of course, they don't speak the language and they can't read the documents, so what's the sense of doing quality control when you're in that situation? And then on the last bullet point here, you can see that in China now, they've been increasing the regulations for higher quality manufacturing, quality control, et cetera. So again, this is 6 years ago, but what I did here was I copied some emails that I had received during the course of this presentation, this course of this work. So you can see from the initial response from the Chinese factory manager. She has been working with the Chinese factory's process engineers and technical staff to come up with a batch record that contains clear and technical staff to come up with a batch record that contains clear and sufficient operational instructions. This is a high priority. Without executable batch records, no validation can begin. The seriousness of the compliance problem at the Chinese factory cannot be overstated. No executable written procedures, including the batch instructions, et cetera. So if you went to China, this is only 6 years ago, in some factories even today, the quality control wasn't very good. And so our auditor that's doing an audit at the facility was bilingual, and we would try to talk to them about improving the quality in certain things. But as you can see here, the initial response from the Chinese factory manager is that they're doing some quality control, but in fact, we found that they really weren't. So you can see here on the next slide. So we sent one of our bilingual auditors in, and this is what they sent to me in an email from China. So they had a face-to-face discussion with the Chinese factory manager to find solutions for significant problems. And then our auditor saying that he can see that he doesn't feel that the Chinese factory people are 100% committed to addressing the problems that came up during the audit. So this is a very common experience. You may be sourcing or buying a product from a Chinese factory, whether that's a commodity component or it's a more sophisticated device, but the quality control at the factory isn't very good. And you can see here what our auditor is saying to me on the email. And then you can see here finally the response from the Chinese manager. I totally agree with your points about making these corrections. I'll get management to do more. And then the lady said, the Chinese factory has also invested quite a lot of time and money in the project. We're definitely losing money, so here goes all the negotiation with the Chinese factory due to the accommodations to meet your quality standards. We want to move the project forward as much as you do. And so the issue of quality control at a Chinese factory can be pretty complex. And how you get people to make changes, that's going to also depend on the order size and the magnitude of the dollars involved, right? I mean, if you're looking for a component, you're going to pay $100,000, the likelihood of them improving the quality control may not be that high. But if you're looking to source $1 million or $2 million for that component, then normally we found that the Chinese factories are more willing to help you to get the factory up to meet international standards. So quality control is a big issue in China. So what I wanted to say is, was anybody in Shanghai, let's say 20 years ago, and they were at the international airport, which is today the domestic airport? You were? Okay, so you can remember that airport was pretty dingy and quite dirty. And the thing about the airport back then was that, the airport was basically, you walked into the airport 20, 25 years ago, and it was a room like this. It was a huge room. There were some doors around the outside, but you never knew which gate, which door was yours for your gate. Do you remember that? And so it was really sort of chaotic. So there'd be like, 5,000 people, 10,000 people sit in a room like this, all jammed together. A plane would come in, and you'd see where the plane was landing, and you'd run to that gate, but you didn't know if that was your plane or it wasn't your plane because there was no markings. So, and also back then, 25 years ago, 20 years ago, when you were in the plane in China and they came down, they would normally bump like crazy. You wondered how many times that Boeing jet was going to continue to be riding. And the other thing is, and the main thing was, that the planes 20 years ago or so, they could all easily be 3 to 5 hours late. So there was no board which said it was updating you on the plane arrival in China or whatever. So you're there waiting for your plane. You don't know which door to go to. A plane comes into one door, and there's like 5,000 people run to that door. But the plane is only for like 300 people. So there's like 4,700 people that are running there for no reason. It was very chaotic. Now, if you go to China, people have been to China recently, the planes pretty much run on time. They may be an hour or two delayed, but they're surely not 3 or 4 or 5 hours delayed, which they were back then. So during that wait time, I was on the second floor cafeteria of the current Shanghai domestic airport, Shanghai International Airport, which is a domestic airport now, before they built Pudong in the east part of Shanghai. And while I was waiting for my plane, 3 or 4 hours or whatever, I was drinking bottled water. And I was drinking the bottled water to stay hydrated, and I didn't know when my plane would come in. And then around 11 p.m. that night, the hostess came out, and she said, listen, we're closing the cafeteria, and we need you to pay the bill. So I paid the bill, and I was still able to sit at that cafeteria. And again, this is on the tablecloths were as dirty as they could be. The cafeteria was really in shambles. But that was the best place to wait. It was on the second floor, and you could see the people in the hall on the first floor waiting for the planes. So I'm still waiting for my plane to come, and finally, it's like 1 in the morning, and I'm still getting very thirsty. So I tucked my head into the sliding door that went into the kitchen, and I saw the lady filling up the bottles with the tap water. So that's a good business, right? If you can fill up bottles from tap water and then sell it to people as bottled water. So that sort of heightens what I'm trying to point out here is the notion of quality control. So I thought I was drinking bottled water. I was just drinking tap water put into bottles. And I think whenever you're doing anything in China or any of the other Asian markets, you have to be very concerned about quality control. So that will conclude my formal comments. How many people are doing work in Asia right now? Okay, only a few. And which countries are you involved with? I'm sorry? China?
Are you Nick? Did you raise your hand?
Singapore. Well, Singapore is a squeaky clean place, and of course the costs in Singapore are more than they are here, so I wouldn't recommend normally sourcing from Singapore. For people that don't know, Singapore is a small island off the Malaysian peninsula, and the per capita income in Singapore is about $15,000 higher than it is in the US. So you wouldn't want to source in Singapore because the cost is too much. Places that people are sourcing now would include China, India, Vietnam, Malaysia. In Malaysia, there's a lot of manufacturing done in Penang, in the northern part of Malaysia. So these are cheaper and they're more reasonable as far as pricing goes.
How many of you work for a company that has considered moving manufacturing overseas? 1, 2, 3? Not so many. That's an interesting dynamic. Ames was very kind to sponsor us today. Thank you.
Sure.
And I know that his time is very short. He'll be leaving us at now?
No, I'm going to be here for another hour or so.
So over ice cream. Be sure to give him your card if you're interested in learning more about quality control or doing business overseas. Ames Gross, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe.